Well, hi again. So we have 3 more nutrient cycles to get through. This next one, the nitrogen cycle, is probably the most complicated, most difficult to learn. I find that students have an easiest time learning it when I present the steps in a linear way. So that's what I will do. So first, do you know how nitrogen exists in the atmosphere? Well, it's present as nitrogen gas. And this makes up 78% of the atmosphere. It's the most abundant gas in the air that you breathe. Now, what do we need nitrogen for? Why do living organisms need it? You just learned that carbon makes up the biggest component of your organic molecules. Nitrogen is also needed to build some of your organic molecules. It is a very important component of proteins, which carry out so many of the functions in your body. It's also an important component of nucleic acids. Nucleic acids includes DNA and RNA. Now, unlike carbon, plants or other producers cannot directly absorb nitrogen gas. We're dependent on bacteria for that. So the first step of the nitrogen cycle is nitrogen fixation, where bacteria that are present either in soil or in water take the nitrogen gas and they can turn it into ammonia. The next step is nitrification, where a different set of bacteria called nitrifying bacteria take the ammonia and they first turn it into nitrite and then nitrate. Nitrate is the molecule that plants absorb the most easily. So the next step is assimilation. Plants absorb nitrate from the soil and they incorporate it into organic molecules such as proteins and nucleic acids. Then we, consumers, can get our source of nitrogen by eating the producers or by eating other animals that have already eaten producers. When plants and animals die, the waste is then decomposed by decomposers in the soil. And our next step of the nitrogen cycle is when different kinds of bacteria take the organic waste from dead plants and animals and they turn the nitrogen in these molecules back into ammonia. And then denitrification is when that ammonia is returned to the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. So this makes it a cycle. We go from nitrogen gas in the atmosphere into these various different conversions until you get back to nitrogen gas. Our next nutrient cycle is the phosphorus cycle. Why do we need phosphorus? Well, phosphorus is a component of your nucleic acids. So it's a big component of nucleic acids, of DNA and RNA. It's also present in phospholipids, which you might remember make up the cell membrane. Now, you don't really need to know the phosphorus cycle as a number of steps. I'll just list some of the most important concepts to focus on as part of learning about the phosphorus cycle. So unlike nitrogen and carbon, there's very little phosphorus present in the atmosphere. This is actually a common question on the AP Environmental Science exam, is remembering that nitrogen, carbon, water, and sulfur, which we'll next talk about, do exist in the atmosphere, but there's very little phosphorus. It's mostly found in soil and rocks, and it's released from rocks and soil through a weathering process that wears down rocks and turns it into phosphate. So this is phosphate. Plants can absorb the phosphate and then incorporate it into their molecules. The phosphate can also leach into water. From there, it goes into oceans, and in the oceans and can get incorporated back into rocks. So that's what makes it, again, a cycle where you release it from rocks through weathering. Eventually, that phosphate gets back into oceans where it's sedimented into rocks, and then it can be gradually released again. Now, the cycle is very, very slow. On a human time scale, it's basically one way, going from land and oceans. Within your lifetime, you would not be able to witness the entire cycle. So the most important parts for you to remember is very little phosphorus in the atmosphere, most found in soil and rocks, being released in weathering, and that it's a slow cycle. The other part to remember is partially because it's such a slow cycle, it tends to be a limiting factor for plant growth. So if plants are not growing well in, say, particular soil, most often it's because there isn't enough phosphorus in there. And our last cycle is the sulfur cycle. So we do need sulfur for building certain molecules, mostly for amino acids. So there's a particular kind of amino acid that we need that includes sulfur. The parts about the sulfur cycle for you to remember is that it is stored in rocks and minerals. Plants can absorb sulfur when it's dissolved in water, and it can enter the atmosphere. So there is sulfur in the atmosphere, and it can enter through volcanic eruptions, through volcanoes, through anaerobic bacteria, forest fires release it, and also many human industrial processes. At the conclusion of this lesson, I'd like to come back to this picture of algae growth in a pond as an example of how an ecosystem can be disrupted. The way you get this excessive algae growth is often through too many nutrients leaching into the water, so excessive nitrates and phosphates. The way they get into the water is often through human impact, so fertilizer from people's lawns or from golf courses leaching into the water, or a human and animal waste getting into the water if there's sewage getting into the water. Or you can also get phosphate if there's laundry detergent leaking in. Now you might wonder, okay, so we get this excessive nitrates and phosphates contributing to algae growing. Why is that bad? Well, let's take a look. So excessive nitrates and phosphates stimulate the algae growth. The algae will eventually start dying. As they die and fall to the bottom of the pond, that encourages bacteria to grow because the bacteria now have more food to decompose. As the bacteria are decomposing the dead algae, they are using dissolved oxygen in the process because they're basically doing cellular respiration, which uses oxygen. So this is the negative consequence, the depletion of oxygen. And when there's too little oxygen, that can cause other aquatic organisms such as fish to die. And this whole process of how excessive nitrates and phosphates can lead to depletion of oxygen is referred to as eutrophication. So a body of water that is undergoing eutrophication has excessive nutrients leading to the depletion of oxygen. Okay, so this is the conclusion of your lesson. Let's take a look at what you learned. You were introduced to environmental systems and feedback loops, both positive and negative feedback loops. And then you learned about biogeochemical cycles, the water cycle, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So that's it for now, and I'll see you next time.